Okay, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you're joining from around the world. I'm delighted to moderate this panel today, organised by LGC Dr. Ehrenstorfer, on a question of quality. Firstly, let me introduce myself. I'm Brian Brookman, and I'm the Chief Scientific Officer for LGC Proficiency Testing. But today, though, we will be concentrating on quality in relation to reference materials, and we have received some great questions. So to be able to address these questions, I'm pleased to say that we have an excellent panel of experienced international experts. So before we take the first question, I'd like to ask the panel members to introduce themselves. So maybe I'll just say, well, Kelly, she'd like to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here and with a panel who I'm very honored to be a part of. So my name's Kelly Black. I work for Neptune & Company, and the reason I'm here is I consult to A2LA, American Association for Laboratory Accreditation, and I'm actually the chair of their Reference Material Technical Advisory Committee. So it's on their behalf that I will be speaking this morning.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Maybe you can go to Thomas.
Okay, thank you for inviting me. My name is Thomas Lensinger. I'm working for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, and we have been producing certified reference materials for decades. Until 2016, we were better known under the name Institute for Reference Materials and Measurements, IRMM, but this name was abolished in 2016. So I'm happy to be here and looking forward to the questions.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Steve.
Hi, good morning, afternoon or evening again. I'm Steve Ellison. I'm based at LGC in the UK at our Teddington National Measurement Laboratory site. On that site, I'm a principal scientist and I have technical oversight of our reference materials production, a lot of which is matrix reference materials, some of which is things like alcohols and some thermal materials.
Okay, thank you, Steve. And Dan.
Hi, and again, thank you for everyone joining. I'm Dan Biggerstaff. I'm the technical director for the Charleston Center of Excellence at LGC's Solution Reference Material Manufacturing site. I founded the site in 1997, really with the idea of being able to provide high quality custom reference materials at a very affordable price. So yeah, I've been in the reference material industry for about 25 years.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Good to see we've got some great expertise there, both in terms of the production of reference materials and the auditing of reference material producers. So hopefully we will be able to provide good answers to all the questions that we've received. So perhaps let's make a start. So the first question I'd like to take is from somebody who said they had recently filed an audit because the reference material they'd purchased was advertised as a 17034 reference material, but the auditor said it was missing some important information. So what the laboratory is asking is, how can they ensure that this doesn't happen to them in the future? So maybe perhaps I could first direct that to Kelly, if that's okay, Kelly.
All right, that's actually a really good question, and it happens frequently. So there's a couple things that I can suggest. One is really a training exercise, being sure that your staff are aware of the information that's required. Under 17034 section 7.14, there are some very specific requirements for what's included on those documents. So it's a great idea for your staff to understand what information they should be seeing to assure that they're getting good quality reference materials. In addition to those requirements, it's necessary for you to have some sort of a marking on the certificate or product information sheet showing that the product was produced under 17034 accreditation. It needs to include the name of the accrediting body and a reference to their scope of accreditation. So those are sort of the things to be aware of to be sure that you got what you asked for. But really, before you even get to that stage, probably the better advice that I can give is to be real clear in the purchasing process about what you want. We do find that if you leave it at all vague, it more often than I'd like to see, happens that people who are expecting certified reference materials don't get materials that were made under accreditation at all.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Maybe as a reference material producer, Thomas, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I agree. There are two things. On the one hand, as a reference material producer, you cannot produce all your materials under your scope of accreditation. Reason, for example, being that if you make a material not too often, it doesn't make sense to include that in your scope, because maintaining the scope would be too much. Normally, the material would be produced under the same quality system, but okay, that may depend on the reference material producer. So indeed, checking, as Kelly said, that this material was indeed produced under the scope of accreditation is important. One thing also to bear in mind, but that should be a last option, it might be that the 17025 auditor puts additional requirements on the reference material certificates which are not in 17034. That maybe is luckily very, very rare, but also there it is important to see what was actually the shortcoming. So that is a question to bear in mind as well. Also, auditors are not infallible. They rarely make mistakes, of course. That's why they are trained a lot. But it needs to be discussed to see what information was missing, in my opinion.
Okay, thanks, Thomas. Was there anything, Steve, that you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I can. I mean, there's a number of things, some of which are suggested by what other people have just said. Thomas said it depends what's missing, and I think that's a good point, because not all materials are certified reference materials, and a certified reference material has to have certified values with a measurement uncertainty and a statement of traceability. A reference material also covers materials that don't have to have that. So you do have to, as Kelly said, make sure you're buying the right kind of material, the right thing. If you needed metrological traceability evidence and you needed measurement uncertainty, then you need to be buying a certified reference material. So it does depend a little bit on what's missing. As Kelly said, there's a list of things that have to be on reference materials documentation in 17034. If any of those things are missing, then technically that's the supplier's fault. The obvious thing to do is to take that up with the supplier. That's the first place to go. Ask them for the information, because not only should it be there if it's required, but they're also obliged to provide reasonable support. So if you've got a technical question about a reference material, a supplier accredited to 17034 should have a process for answering it. They've also got obliged to have processes for resolving complaints. So if you don't get satisfied with an immediate question, you can make it a formal complaint. They have to then go through a formal process to address that. And that might go a little way to make sure that doesn't happen again. And finally, if you're still not satisfied, there is a process of complaining to the accreditation body. So you can take a material complaint to the accreditation body, and they'll pick that up at the next audit for that supplier. So if it turns out to be a supplier fault that the supplier can't address, and I think most would, you do have recourse to the accreditation body as well.
That's great, Steve, and thank you to Kelly and to Thomas. Now, I think that should have hopefully helped the person who asked this question, or indeed other laboratories who are considering the same thing. There's lots of information there to digest and consider. So I think maybe we can move on to question 2, which is perhaps a fairly fundamental question. The person has asked, what's the difference between ISO 17025 and ISO 17034? And maybe I could throw that one over to Dan, first of all.
There is 2 different accreditations. ISO 17025 is the accreditation for a testing and calibration laboratory. And what it does is it assures that that testing lab has a quality management plan in place, uses validated instrumentation, validated methods, has documented data quality, and can generate traceable data. ISO 17034 is the accreditation for the manufacturer of reference materials. And it assures that the manufacturer has a quality management plan in place. Its manufacturing processes are traceable. It's using metrologically valid methods to verify the certified values on the certificate. And the uncertainty is a total combined uncertainty on the values that are certified. All of the testing of the products for a certified reference material must come from an ISO 17025 accredited laboratory, which is in almost all cases the quality control laboratory for that manufacturer.
Okay, thank you, Dan. That's a comprehensive answer. Thomas, was there anything you wanted to add?
Not really. I completely agree. 17025 and 17034 cover 2 completely different activities. Of course, 17034, reference material production, usually requires testing. Therefore, 17025 is required. But you can be perfectly a competent testing laboratory or even calibration laboratory, and you might not be competent as a reference material producer. So, yeah, two different things.
Okay, thank you. I think that's given a good coverage, or a good answer, should we say, to that question. So let me move on to question 3. And the person here asked that the company which they buy their reference materials from, say that their lab is accredited to ISO 17034, but on their website. But they want to know, how do they know if the product itself, that's the reference material, if you like, is actually accredited to 17034? They're asking, what should they look for? Now, perhaps before I throw this over to the panelists, LGC Dr. Ehrenstorfer did carry out a recent poll of its customers on this issue, and maybe I'll share the results with you. So the question they asked to their customers, is it true that if a supplier is accredited to ISO 17034, their reference materials are also accredited to 17034? Now, 20% of the respondents said yes, that was true, 75% no, and 5% said they were not sure. So I think it's an interesting question for our panelists to address. Maybe I'll just go back to you, Thomas, to start with on that one.
What evidence to look for? This depends a little bit on the RM producer. Basically, what you would look for, as Kelly said in response to the first question, if there is a logo of an accreditation body accompanied by the accreditation number, so the number under which the accreditation is registered, that would mean that the product in question, that the reference material in question has been produced under that scope of accreditation. If that is not the case, then most likely it is not produced under the scope of accreditation. Of course, a reference material producer might choose not to put the accreditation logo on it, even if it is under the scope of accreditation, but that would not be particularly clever, because in the end they make all the effort and then they don't get the benefit of showing that they fulfill this requirement. So basically, look for a logo of an accreditation body, look for an accreditation number, registration number, and if that is there, then the material should be under the scope of accreditation.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Kelly, would you like to add anything to that?
I guess I will add, but mainly I'm just going to reiterate what Thomas has already said, and maybe just kind of put it in order of the simplest and most direct ways to answer the question of whether a specific product is made under accreditation when the entire organization is accredited to 17034. So the first thing I would do is just ask. ISO, the standards are written in such a way that, as Steve alluded to earlier, the reference material producer is required to communicate well with their customers, both before and after you purchase an item. So don't hesitate to reach out and just talk to them. That's a good starting point. Second thing you might do, as Thomas was mentioning, is look at their scope of accreditation and be sure that the item that you're looking to purchase is really right there on their scope of accreditation. And then, although Thomas said it wouldn't be such a wise idea, it is not uncommon for reference material producers to offer material as either a accredited a product made under accreditation or not. So in many cases, you're allowed to purchase the same product and just choose whether you want that extra level of quality associated with it. And so even if you've gone through the first steps and you're sure that they make your product under accreditation, again, once you receive it, be sure that you got the right paperwork to support that that's really what you got. Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Kelly. And as I was saying, hopefully that's given some good information for laboratories to look out for. Another question we've received, interestingly, says it seems like all reference material manufacturers claim to be the best quality. And what the person asking the question is saying is, so what's the true way that they can know whether they're getting the best quality product? And are there things that they should look for on the certificate?
Start with looking, is the value of the certified value, the level, is that suitable? Is the uncertainty sufficiently small? You don't need necessarily to have the material with the smallest uncertainty. It needs to be sufficiently small, so small compared to your measurement uncertainty. Also, an issue, I think, is looking at the traceability statement. Is there a clear traceability statement and a meaningful traceability statement? And the traceability statement cannot be traceability to an organization. So this material is traceable to Institute XY doesn't make sense, regardless of how good that institution XY is. That from a metrological perspective is just not useful. So if you see that kind of comments or statements on the certificate, at least it should raise questions if that reference material producer really is giving you the information. And then in the end, in this case, I would then go back what Dan suggested, go back to the producer, ask, what do you mean with that traceability statement? So asking back, and last but not least, also looking to see if that is a one-off production of a reference material, or does that reference material producer have a longer history of materials? Of course, everybody has to start somewhere and somewhere, but if that material was produced 5 years ago and since then the organization hasn't made a single other reference material since then, they might maybe not be very good at it. It certainly is not their core business. Again, that would be the moment to go back to the organization and ask about what they do. And with this information, I think you should be able to confirm that the material is fit for your purpose. You may not have got the best material that is available or the best in the world, but you will be sure that you have a material that serves its purpose in your measurement. And that is in the end what you need to do.
as manufacturers, we do want to minimize our uncertainty and have the product produced as precisely as possible. I think people need to be a little bit careful about looking at that uncertainty value on the certificates, because it really needs to be truly representative of that product. If a manufacturer, say, could report a total combined uncertainty, but not necessarily include every aspect of uncertainty associated with each of the components of it, then they could actually report an uncertainty that is lower than what it should be for that particular reference material, which can have significant impact on the interpretation of data, especially data that's used for regulatory reporting, health and safety. If a product, say in the environmental testing industry, has been tested for hazardous material content, and if they underreport it, then a hazardous material may go into a non-hazardous landfill, which could have huge, environmental and health impacts in the future. So the user of the reference materials, I think, should have conversations with their providers on just how inclusive that uncertainty value actually is.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the other panelists there. I mean, obviously, as the question said, yes, many reference material manufacturers will claim to be the best quality, but there's some good information there coming from our panelists in terms of what else to look out for and try to sort of at least identify, the right reference materials for you, or what's fit for purpose and what's fit for your purpose. Some of those answers was talking about the certificate and what to look for in the certificate. And that kind of comes on to our next question, which says, why isn't everybody's certificate the same? Are there not ISO requirements that indicate what needs to be included on the certificate?
We're probably moving towards a world in which certificates are electronic and become machine readable. That hasn't happened yet, but as it does, we're going to have standards which are very much more prescriptive about exactly how you provide machine readable information on certificates. So, for example, if we want laboratories to be able to download key information straight into their LIMS system, there's going to have to be very clear interfaces around that. And I think we'll see harmonization around that goes far beyond what, if, as Kelly said, the basic requirements that have to be on a certificate under 17034 at the moment. So I think an electronic world is going to look a bit different.
Hopefully that's answered the question. I mean, clearly everyone's certificates are not the same. I don't think they're likely to ever be the same, but yes, there are, the key requirements stipulated by ISO, which will be there. I think we can change subject slightly. And for another question we received, it says that are reference material manufacturers required to take into account shipping conditions when calculating shelf life? Maybe I'll come straight back to you, Dan, on that one. That's okay.
Sure. Yeah, a CRM product has to have the transportation uncertainty included in the total combined uncertainty for the shipping of the product. And if you ship that product at a different temperature than the recommended storage condition, then that certainly can have an impact on that certified value. So there's kind of two ways that can be approached. One of them is to actually determine what that increase in uncertainty is associated with the shipping, and then include that in your total combined uncertainty. Another way to approach that would be to reduce the shelf life by the appropriate amount of time that would compensate for that additional uncertainty. If you demonstrate as a manufacturer that even though you're shipping at a different temperature, it has no impact on the certified value, then you can use 0 for your transportation uncertainty.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Kelly, did you wish to add something to that?
You know, I was kind of chomping at the bit waiting to answer that, but Dan did such an excellent job that I think I'm just going to leave it right with what he said.
Okay, was there anything from you, Steve or Thomas, wanted to add? Or I think Dan's given a pretty good answer to that one.
Yeah, I guess it depends how tightly you read the question. Because under 17034, shelf life effectively means the life at the producer's premises in producer storage. And that's before we've shipped it. So of course that isn't affected by any shipping conditions. However, we've got some other responsibilities under 17034 which we have to pay some attention to. The first one, Dan's absolutely right. You've got to ship the stuff and you're responsible for the shipping conditions and you're responsible for making sure that the material arrives intact and usable. So we are obliged to do quite a lot of work to make sure that the shipping conditions are adequate. They don't materially affect the use of the material. The other thing we're responsible for is the instructions we give to the end user. So if we've got instructions for storage and use of the material, we're responsible for making sure there's evidence to back those up. So if we say, you can store this in a refrigerator unopened for 2 months, we've tried it. So yes, we have to take that into account. And so we've got those 3 parts of the equation. If we thought that shipping was going to affect the shelf life at the user's premises, we'd restrict the shelf life at the user's premises. Much more likely, though, we'd change the method of shipping. We'd make dang sure that it's not going to make a difference to the shelf life for the user. And if it's really critical, we'll do things like sticking in temperature trackers and so on to make sure that it arrives at the right temperatures, that's been the right temperatures all the way. So we try and control the shipping so that it doesn't make a difference. But Dan's absolutely right. Another way of doing it is to make an allowance for the kind of effects that could occur during shipping in the uncertainty.
So let's move on to another question, which is around packaging. The question is, what, if any, requirements are there regarding packaging in Guide 34? The question said, and I'm sure we'll refer to 17034. They wondered about quality and cleanliness of the vial or the ampoule, and in terms of what might be assessed.
And there's a general duty in 17034 to provide appropriate packaging. And dirty packaging is not appropriate. So yes, there's a requirement there to look after the packaging. There's also a requirement to manage the production environment, the facilities, including the packaging environment, to avoid contamination. So there are provisions there to make sure that the material is in a clean vial and it is an uncontaminated material. So those are fairly specific, and an accreditation assessor will go after them. They will check for compliance with those. And that's in addition to the fact that, as Kelly says, homogeneity is in final packaged form, not just on the bulk. So adventitious impurities, you hope, will be picked up by, if it's widespread, you'll pick it up in homogeneity testing. Similarly, you're worried about the stability of packaged units, not the bulk. So there's a fair bit there to control packaging. You can also look at the fact that shipping conditions have to be appropriate, and that will include packaging beyond the immediate vial. You've got to make sure that the thing arrives intact.
Further thoughts from you, Dan, or from you, Thomas, on that one at all?
Yeah, well, I would expand on the appropriate, because it's not only homogeneity, it's also stability that comes in. So packaging may need dark ampules to make sure that light is shielded, or boxes air-free, moisture or inert gas, so packaging must be appropriate to ensure homogeneity and stability. And for the rest, of course, there are still the other legal requirements for packaging of chemicals that apply to reference materials as well. So if it is a dangerous good, then you need to have the hazard labels and the hazard information on it. And if you ship these materials which are dangerous goods, so the packaging, the outer packaging must be appropriate and in line with the regulation of the means of transport that you're shipping it. So all of this comes, of course, in as well. And that is what I wanted to add.
So Dan, was there anything else further you wanted to add, or is that covered it?
I think they did a very comprehensive job.
Okay, so let's move on to another question, which may be the last one we have time for today. But many sort of labs will talk about or understand that sometimes they need to have a second source for a reference material. And the question here is, what qualifies as a second source? Now, again, there was a poll carried out by LGC Dr. Ehrenstorfer recently amongst its customers, where they simply asked that question, really: what qualifies as a second source reference material? I think they must have given options. So they had an option of a second lot from the same manufacturer, of which no one thought that was appropriate. There was an RM from another manufacturer, which 30% thought was appropriate. But then there did seem to be an option for both, which was 59%, and 11% said second sources are not required. So I'm not sure the poll perhaps really identified perhaps totally what everybody thought, and clearly there's a bit of an issue here, and it would be interesting to hear from the panelists. Maybe I'll start with you, Steve.
I don't know of a particular standard that actually requires that in the ISO pantheon. I suspect some do, and I just haven't read them. But the theory there is fairly straightforward. If you want to check something, you can't check it with itself very reliably. So if your reference material is down by a factor of 2 on its level, and you check your calibration against that, you're going to get what looks like the right answer and still be wrong. So you're looking for some way of checking independently. As to what makes a good independent check, well, essentially, the further away from what you got the first time, the better. I don't think there's a simple answer to that, but yes, if you had for example, if you had a producer who produced quality control materials, that's a really useful way of checking for calibrations done with a material produced by a producer producing calibration materials. So they're deliberately produced with different purposes, and it might be worth buying the quality control material from a second manufacturer so that you do have a genuine independent check.
Thank you, Steve. Dan, did you have any points to make on that one?
Sure, I can kind of talk about our experience, especially here in the U.S. A lot of the drive, of course, that we've seen for second source material or independent calibration verification material comes from the EPA and the regulatory environment. One of the things they're highly concerned about is making sure that the data that's reported to them is legally defensible. So just exactly like Steve said, if you make a calibration curve, if one of the components is off, and you validate or try to validate that curve with the same standard, you're going to get the right value or the right recovery, even though the concentrations could be wildly off. So by using a material that was produced completely independently from that calibration, then you can actually legally make sure that that calibration curve is giving the quality of data that is needed. Now, as far as what would constitute a second source, our opinion is also what Steve said. It needs to be as far away from the primary material as possible.
Thank you, Dan. Thomas, was there anything you wanted to add on that one at all?
Nothing technically on the need and what a second source is, just maybe where the demand comes from. Another source of the demand might be the definition of certified reference material, which says in one of the notes that a given CRM cannot be used for two different purposes in one measurement process. So that might also be one of the reasons for having a second source. And indeed, as was discussed by Steve and Dan, if you want to effectively control your measurement, you won't be able to avoid it. You need to have a second source.
Okay, thank you. And like all these things, there's probably plenty of other questions we could answer, but I think we're probably going to need to draw to a close. But perhaps before we finish, it might just be useful if I perhaps ask the panel members on any advice of perhaps where labs could seek further information on ISO requirements ahead of their next audit, say, and maybe perhaps to be able to answer some of the questions we haven't answered. Now, I appreciate the panel members are from different parts of the world, so maybe their suggested sources may be a little different. So maybe I'll start with you, Kelly. Any thoughts on that one? Or advice?
Well, of course. I personally do a lot of training on ISO 17034, and it's been really exciting. I guess that tells you what kind of a person I am, but it's been really exciting seeing the growth in reference materials over the past decade or so, especially since the latest version of 17025, the standard for laboratories, came out, putting more emphasis on the need for reference materials. There are more and more folks getting involved in producing them. So I guess I would say there are many different resources, but the one that I would recommend that I work with is AWPT, A2LA Workplace Training, and they offer quite a few different courses on this. So I would, of course, recommend them, but there are others as well. And now that you've watched this panel session, you know at least 5 more friendly neighborhood reference material experts of sorts. So there's a community of us who are working to continue moving this area forward and are usually happy to help.
Thank you, Kelly. Any advice from you, Thomas?
That depends, of course, which kind of audit it is. If it's a 17 or 25 audit, there is also quite a good webpage of Eurolab, so www.eurolab.org, which has the so-called cookbooks for different sections of ISO 17 or 25. So that is a good source of information as well. Otherwise, indeed, training courses from accreditation bodies can help a lot. And ask other laboratories, ask for their experience. By and large, my experience, people are quite forthcoming with information, trying to help each other.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Steve.
Well, with a slightly different hat on, LGC participates in Eurochem, and that's Euro with an A. And there's a bunch of guides from Eurochem that cover a range of issues. The central one, perhaps, is the guide on accreditation for chemical laboratories, which provides an interpretation of 17025 for laboratories. But there's also guides on measurement uncertainty, method validation, selection and use of reference materials on the same website, plus some short reading in the form of information leaflets. So that's one area. Most producers, RM producers, of course, carry their own documentation, and LGC is no exception. If you hit the LGC websites and the LGC standards websites, you'll find quite a lot of information about use of reference materials in particular. Accreditation bodies also often provide training directly. In the UK, UCAS provide training on accreditation principles. So there's quite a lot of places. And I definitely echo Thomas's suggestion. The Eurolab cookbooks are well worth a look. They're nicely written, quite brief, specific to topics, nice and clear.
Thank you, Steve. I know it's a bit tough to come to you last, Dan, given that the other three have probably come up with many sources of information. Let me just see if you've got any other thoughts or advice.
Sure. I'll actually give A2LA an excellent review. We use their resources very heavily. There are a lot of online resources, a lot of online consultants and classes that can be taken. And we've taken advantage of quite a few of those in our own organization. But one of the things that we have found is that the training and information from A2LA is always detailed and just top notch.
Thank you, Dan. And so there's a wealth of possible information sources there given. So if we haven't managed to answer everyone's questions today, then I'm sure that hopefully those sources or ideas will be able to answer. You'll be able to follow those up to answer them. So as I say, unfortunately, that is all we have time for in this session. Firstly, I'd like to thank our panel members who have given up their time today to address many of your questions, and who I'm sure you will agree have helped you to clarify a number of issues, or I hope they've helped you to clarify a number of issues. I'd like to thank everybody who has submitted such useful or excellent questions for our panel to address. And I'd like to thank all of you who have joined to watch this panel discussion today. And then finally, I'd like to thank the staff at LGC Dr. Ehrenstorfer who have organised this useful panel discussion. So really, that's a thank you from me and a goodbye from me, and I'm sure a goodbye from our panel members. So thank you very much. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.